Topic 3.1, Principles of Sensation. We will go on a journey through the principles of sensation and the contributions of researchers to how we understand it. In the first part, we will look at the principles that let us organize information from the senses. In the second part, we will move to sensory transduction. How do our sensory organs convert physical stimuli to neural signals? Finally, we will look at the research contributions of Gustav Fechner, David Hubel, Ernst Weber, and Torsten Wiesel. How can you complete their work in a world that always changes? Stable awareness of the external world is a fundamental aspect of human perception. To achieve this, our brains employ various principles and processes to organize and integrate sensory information. These principles help us make sense of the chaotic barrage of sensations we encounter daily. Here, we'll explore some key principles that contribute to this stable awareness. Gestalt principles. Gestalt psychology is about how our brains naturally organize sensory information, sometimes partial, into meaningful wholes. Several Gestalt principles aid in this process. Figure ground. When we perceive a scene or image, we naturally separate the main subject, the figure, from its surrounding background. For instance, when we look at a photograph, we focus on the main subject and just acknowledge the background. Proximity. Objects that are physically close to each other are often perceived as a group or related, even if they differ in other aspects. This principle helps us organize elements within our visual field. Similarity. Objects that share common characteristics, such as shape or color, tend to be perceived as belonging together. Think of a group of red apples among green ones. Closure. Our brains often fill in missing parts of an image to perceive it as a complete whole. For example, when you see an incomplete circle or square, your brain naturally completes it. Depth perception. It is important to understand the three-dimensional parts of the world to navigate it well. Depth perception uses both monocular and binocular cues. Monocular cues, these cues require only one eye and include linear perspective, parallel lines appearing to converge, relative size, objects closer to us appear larger, and interposition, objects blocking others are perceived as closer. Binocular cues. These cues depend on input from both eyes, such as retinal disparity, the slight difference in images seen by each eye, and convergence, the degree to which our eyes turn inward to focus on a near object. Top-down processing. In this mental process, we use past knowledge, expectations, and context to interpret sensory information. For instance, to read a book relies on top-down processing, as your brain recognizes letters and words based on your language knowledge and its rules. Bottom-up processing. This process begins when you analyze sensory information from the bottom, with a start at sensory receptors and progress to higher-level mental functions. You build knowledge from raw sensory data. When you see a new animal in the wild, your brain processes its features, fur, shape, and movement, before you identify it as a specific species. We have explored the general principles that guide our sensations of the external world, from Gestalt principles to depth perception. This is just the start. Now let's go further into how our sensory systems translate external sensations into the language of the brain. We'll look at sensory transduction and include concepts like absolute threshold, difference threshold, signal detection, and sensory adaptation, which help us know the limit and powers of our senses. Sensory transduction. Sensory transduction is a process in psychology that involves the conversion of physical stimuli from the external world into neural signals that our brain can interpret. It occurs in specialized receptor cells located in our sensory organs, such as the eyes, ears, skin, and taste buds. These receptors translate various forms of energy, light, sound, pressure, and chemicals, into electrical signals that can be transmitted to the brain for further processing. Certain concepts carry it further. Absolute threshold. The absolute threshold is the minimum amount of stimulus energy required for a person to detect a particular stimulus 50% of the time. It represents the boundary between sensory perception and sensory absence. Imagine sitting in a quiet room and you can barely hear a faint whisper. The lowest sound level at which you detect that whisper 50% of the time is your absolute threshold for hearing. Difference threshold, also known as the just noticeable difference, or JND. The difference threshold, or J&D, refers to the smallest noticeable change in a stimulus that a person can detect. It varies depending on the type of stimulus and the individual's sensitivity. If you're holding a stack of weights, you might notice when an additional weight is added, but not if a very small weight is added. The difference threshold is the weight that, when added, you can just barely notice a difference. Signal detection. Signal detection theory explores how individuals make decisions about the presence or absence of a stimulus in uncertain situations. It considers not only sensory processes, but also decision-making processes and the influence of factors like motivation and expectation. Think of a radiologist looking at x-rays for signs of disease. They must decide whether a faint shadow on an x-ray represents a real abnormality or just noise. Signal detection theory helps explain their decision-making process, which isn't solely based on the presence of physical signals, but also their own biases and goals. Sensory adaptation. Sensory adaptation is a phenomenon where our sensory receptors become less responsive to a constant stimulus over time. It allows us to filter out unchanging or irrelevant information from the environment and focus on new or changing stimuli. If you step into a warm bath, the initial sensation of the water's temperature is quite noticeable. However, after a few minutes, you may become less aware of it as your skin receptors adapt to the constant temperature. We looked into sensory transduction and considered some of the remarkable processes by which our sensory organs convert physical stimuli into neural signals, but this journey is far from over. Therefore, let's move on to the research contributions of Ernst Weber, Gustav Fechner, David Hubel, and Torsten Wiesel. Their work builds upon the principles of sensation and sensory transduction, but also connects these principles and the research that reshaped our knowledge of sensation. Ernst Weber. Ernst Weber is known for his work in the field of psychophysics, particularly Weber's law. Weber's law states that the just noticeable difference, J and D, between two stimuli is a constant proportion of the original stimulus intensity. In other words, it quantified the relationship between the magnitude of a stimulus and the sensitivity of perception. Weber's law has far-reaching implications in understanding human perception across various sensory modalities. It provides insights into how humans discriminate between different levels of stimuli, such as sound, touch, and taste. Weber's work laid the foundation for Fechner's later developments in psychophysics. Gustav Fechner. Gustav Fechner is known for his pioneering work in psychophysics. He developed the concept of the just noticeable difference, J and D, which is the smallest difference in stimulus intensity that can be perceived by an observer. His work laid the foundation for quantifying the relationship between physical stimuli and psychological perceptions. Fechner's research bridged the gap between the physical world and the world of subjective human experience. His methods and principles in psychophysics are still influential in the study of sensory perception and how the mind interprets sensory information. He also supported Weber's work with research. David Hubel and Torsten Wiesel. David Hubel and Torsten Wiesel were neuroscientists whose groundbreaking work focused on the structure and function of the visual system. They conducted extensive research on the visual cortex in the brain, particularly in cats and monkeys, using microelectrode recordings. Hubel and Wiesel's research uncovered the concept of feature detectors in the visual cortex. They found that certain neurons in the visual cortex responded selectively to specific features of visual stimuli, such as edges, motion, and orientation. This discovery revolutionized our understanding of how the brain processes visual information and contributed significantly to the field of visual perception. Their research is also often involved in discussions of the use of animals and the ethics of it in psychological research. And here's the twist. When I worked to edit my notes for this video, the large language model I worked with hallucinated up all of these men at work together in a lab to make a unified theory of perception. They were not alive at the same time for this to be possible, though their research definitely helped each other. Large language models and AI, AGI only know what seems good together, not what goes together. Are we any different though? You all are alive at the same time. Go out there and make a unified theory of sensation or perception. Go win a Nobel Prize. Help programs and databases truly sense and then perceive. Win a second Nobel Prize. It's all up to you.